They served my favorite lasagna. My little brother Marcus played guitar in the corner. My father said it was a family celebration to welcome me home. But I knew exactly what it was. An intervention where I was the disappointment they needed to fix, and my military service was the mistake they needed me to admit. I'm Captain Sarah Chen. My father tried to break me by calling me worthless. What he didn't expect was that I'd prove him wrong on a battlefield he'd never understand. That night, in front of the entire extended family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Aunts, uncles, cousins who'd driven hours to see the prodigal daughter return. They told me exactly what they thought of my 8 years in the army. Sarah's finally ready to come home for good, my father announced, raising his wine glass like he was toasting a recovery from addiction. Ready to put this military phase behind her and start a real career. The room nodded approvingly. Aunt Linda smiled like I'd just announced my engagement to a doctor. Uncle Robert patted my shoulder like I'd finally seen the light. They all looked at me in my civilian clothes, jeans and a sweater Mom had picked out, as if the uniform had been a costume I'd finally outgrown. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because they genuinely believed I'd driven 6 hours from Fort Bragg to surrender my career to their suburban expectations. Like I was still that uncertain 18-year-old who'd enlisted because she couldn't afford college, not the officer who'd spent the last 3 years coordinating multi-domain operations across 4 different theaters. The room went quiet when my laugh echoed a little too long. Then my father cleared his throat and pulled out a manila folder, thick with printed job listings and application forms. Real estate, insurance, bank management trainee programs. All the careers he'd researched for me, all the lives he'd decided I should want. I've made some calls, he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of absolute authority. Johnson and Associates is looking for someone with leadership experience. They're willing to overlook the military thing. Fresh start, Sarah. Clean slate. I stared at the folder. Inside were highlighted salary ranges that were less than half my current military pay, benefit packages that couldn't compete with what I already had, and job descriptions that made my brain hurt with their monotony. Customer relations, team coordination, administrative oversight, words that meant nothing, jobs that built nothing, careers that served no one but shareholders. What if I'm not interested in a fresh start? I asked. My father's smile tightened. Sarah, you're 26 years old. You can't play soldier forever. It's time to grow up, settle down, maybe find a nice man who doesn't mind that you've been away. Away. Like I'd been at summer camp instead of leading reconnaissance missions in Syria. Like my Bronze Star was a participation trophy. Like the soldiers under my command were imaginary friends I'd finally outgrown. I'm not playing anything, Dad. I'm a captain in the United States Army. I lead real missions with real consequences. You're a girl with a gun and some fancy titles they give everyone nowadays, he said, his voice rising. And frankly, Sarah, it's made you hard. Unfeminine. Your mother and I didn't raise you to bark orders at men twice your age. The room held its breath. Marcus stopped playing guitar. My mother stared at her hands. 24 pairs of eyes watched as my father reduced 8 years of service, 3 deployments, and countless lives saved to a personality defect that needed correcting. That's when I knew this wasn't a welcome home dinner. It was a trial, and I was both the defendant and the evidence of my own crime. They'd already decided I was guilty of becoming someone they didn't recognize, someone they couldn't control, someone who'd forgotten her place. The silence stretched until my father leaned forward, his voice dropping to that calm, measured tone he used when he was about to deliver what he considered checkmate. You know, Sarah, if you're not ready to think about your own future, maybe you should consider Marcus's. My blood went cold. I looked across the room at my little brother, still holding his guitar, confusion flickering across his 17-year-old face. Marcus, who'd written me letters every week during my deployments. Who'd saved every newspaper clipping about military operations, wondering if his big sister was involved. Who'd worn my old army t-shirt to school so often that Mom had to buy him 3 more just like it. What does Marcus have to do with anything? I asked. though I already knew I wasn't going to like the answer. My father smiled, the same smile he'd worn when he'd convinced my mother to take a second mortgage on the house, when he'd talked my grandfather out of his savings for a sure-thing investment that never materialized. Well, Marcus has been talking about following in your footsteps. Military service, he says, thinks it sounds exciting. Marcus straightened up, his eyes lighting up with that dangerous enthusiasm of a teenager who'd found his calling. I've been researching the different branches, Sarah. I think I want to go Army, like you. Maybe infantry or… Absolutely not, my father cut him off. Marcus is going to college. He's got a full academic scholarship to state, pre-law track. He's going to be something important, something respectable. Not some government employee with a gun. I watched my brother's face fall, watched him set down his guitar with the careful movements of someone trying not to break. Marcus had always been the golden child, the one who got straight A's without trying, who could charm teachers and neighbors, and everyone who met him. But he'd also been the one who'd built model planes, and studied military history, and asked me 1,000 questions about tactics and leadership every time I came home. Marcus should make his own choice, I said carefully. Marcus is 17, my father replied. He doesn't know what he wants. He's been influenced by all these stories you've filled his head with, all this glorification of violence and danger. He thinks it's some kind of adventure game. It's not a game, Dad. It's service. It's protecting people who can't protect themselves. It's wasting his potential, my father snapped. Marcus has the grades for Harvard Law. He could be a judge, a senator, someone who actually matters. But if he throws that away to go play war like his sister, if he comes back broken, or damaged, or… He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. Marcus looked between us, his face pale. I just thought. You thought wrong, my father said, not unkindly but with absolute finality. Sarah made her choice, and look where it's gotten her. 26, unmarried, no real career prospects, calling orders at men who probably laugh at her behind her back. You're better than that, son. We raised you better than that. I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break. I'd been through too much to break that easily, but crack, like ice under pressure. Marcus was everything I'd never been. Brilliant, beloved, blessed, with every advantage I'd had to fight for. And if my father was willing to crush his dreams just to prove a point about mine, then this wasn't about my career at all. Timidar. This was about control. About keeping his children small enough to fit in the boxes he'd built for us. About making sure we never became anything he couldn't understand or claim credit for. So here's what's going to happen, my father continued. You're going to take one of these jobs, settle down, and stop filling your brother's head with fantasies about military service. Or Marcus is going to learn the hard way what happens when Chen children don't listen to their father. I looked at Marcus, really looked at him. 17 years old. Still believing that adults always knew best, still trusting that the people who loved him would want what was best for him. Still young enough to be crushed by disappointment, to have his dreams redirected before he was strong enough to fight back. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm 26 years old. I've been serving in the United States Army for 8 years, ever since I graduated high school with mediocre grades and parents who made it clear that college wasn't in the budget for daughters who, quote, weren't serious about their futures. In my family, success was measured by silence and compliance. Girls were supposed to find stable jobs, marry well, and produce grandchildren who would carry on the family name and reputation. My father, David Chen, had built his identity around being the patriarch who knew best. He worked in middle management at an insurance company, drove a leased BMW, and wore suits that cost more than my monthly military salary. He measured worth by salary figures and social status, by how impressive you sounded at neighborhood barbecues and high school reunions. In his world, military service was something poor kids did when they couldn't afford college or weren't smart enough for real careers. It was a last resort, a temporary detour before you came to your senses and joined the civilian workforce like a responsible adult. The idea that someone might choose the military, might build a career around service and sacrifice, was completely foreign to him. My mother, Linda, had been a teacher before she married my father and became a full-time homemaker. She measured her success by how well her children reflected her parenting. A daughter in the military wasn't just unconventional, It was a personal failure, proof that she'd somehow raised a girl who couldn't find her proper place in the world. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Growing up, I'd watched the way my parents treated achievement. When Marcus won academic awards, they threw parties and called relatives. When I won athletic competitions or leadership roles, they smiled politely and changed the subject. Academic success was valuable because it led to profitable careers. Physical achievements were just hobbies that distracted from real goals. I'd enlisted partly out of necessity. College wasn't financially realistic, but mostly because something in me was drawn to the idea of earning respect through merit, not connections. In basic training, nobody cared who your parents were or what car they drove. They cared whether you could lead, whether you could perform under pressure, whether your teammates could count on you when everything went wrong. The Army had given me everything my family couldn't: clear expectations, measurable achievements, and a hierarchy based on competence rather than politics. When I excelled, I got promoted. When I showed leadership potential, I got more responsibility. When I proved myself in combat situations, I earned recognition that meant something. Over 8 years, I'd risen from private to captain. I'd completed 3 deployments, earned a Bronze Star for valor, and had been selected for advanced tactical training that less than 5% of officers ever received. I'd coordinated joint operations between Army, Navy, and Air Force units. I'd managed budgets larger than most small businesses and led teams of soldiers who would follow me into situations that could get them killed. But every time I came home, I became Sarah the disappointment again. Sarah who'd chosen danger over safety, service over profit, duty over self-interest. Sarah who was getting older without getting married, who was becoming harder and more masculine with each deployment, who was wasting her potential on a career that would never make her parents proud. The military had a word for people who understood this kind of service: warriors. My family had a different word for them: unmarriageable. In their world, a woman who could survive combat operations and manage crisis situations was somehow less valuable than one who could manage a household and keep a husband happy. They didn't see the letters from soldiers I'd mentored, the commendations from superior officers, the lives saved through decisions I'd made under fire. They saw a daughter who'd forgotten her place, who'd traded femininity for authority, who'd chosen respect from strangers over approval from family. This wasn't the first time my father had crushed dreams that didn't align with his vision of success. I'd watched him do it before, systematically and thoroughly, to anyone in our family who dared to want something different. My cousin Jessica had wanted to be an artist. She'd gotten into a prestigious art school in California, had even secured a partial scholarship. But my father convinced her parents that art was a hobby, not a career. Jessica ended up studying business administration, graduated with honors, and now manages accounts for a marketing firm. She still paints sometimes, on weekends, watercolors that she hides in her spare bedroom like contraband. My Uncle Tony had dreams of opening a restaurant. He'd worked in kitchens since he was 15, had saved every penny, even had investors lined up. But my father sat him down with spreadsheets and statistics about restaurant failure rates, convinced him that food service was unstable and beneath his intelligence. Tony became an accountant instead. He still cooks elaborate meals for family gatherings, but there's something hollow in his eyes when he talks about fiscal responsibility and retirement planning. Even my mother had been a victim, though she'd never admit it. Before she married my father, she'd wanted to teach at the university level, maybe pursue a PhD in literature. But my father had convinced her that advanced degrees were unnecessary for women, and that her real calling was supporting his career and raising his children. She gave up her dreams to become the perfect military wife, patient, supportive, and quietly resentful of any woman who chose differently. I'd thought I was safe because I'd already left. I'd escaped before he could redirect my life into something more acceptable. I'd built a career he couldn't touch, earned respect he couldn't diminish, achieved things he couldn't claim credit for or take away. But I'd underestimated his long-term strategy. He hadn't given up on controlling me. He'd just been waiting for the right leverage. And Marcus was perfect leverage. My brother represented everything I'd never been. Academically gifted, socially adept, naturally charming. Where I'd been stubborn and questioning, Marcus was agreeable and trusting. Where I'd fought for everything I wanted, Marcus had always been handed opportunities. He was my father's masterpiece, the child who proved that David Chen's parenting methods worked. And now Marcus was showing signs of independence, of wanting something my father couldn't understand or control. Military service wasn't just foreign to my father, it was threatening. It represented values he didn't share. Honor over profit, service over self-interest, sacrifice over safety. If Marcus enlisted, my father would lose more than a son to Harvard Law School. He'd lose proof that his worldview was correct, that success meant climbing corporate ladders and accumulating wealth and status symbols. Marcus choosing the military would validate everything my father had spent 8 years trying to dismiss about my own choices. But there was something else, something darker that I was just beginning to understand. My father didn't just disagree with military service, he was actively contemptuous of it. The way he said "girl with a gun," the way he dismissed my Bronze Star as meaningless decoration, the way he referred to my soldiers as men who quote, probably laugh at me behind my back. He wasn't just trying to redirect Marcus's ambitions. He was trying to prove that military service was inherently worthless, that people like me were deluded fools playing dress-up with real authority, that women in combat roles were particularly ridiculous, pretending to competence they couldn't possibly possess. I'd spent 8 years proving myself to superior officers, to fellow soldiers, to enemy combatants who had no choice but to respect my capabilities. But I'd never proven myself to my father, and I was starting to realize that I never could. His dismissal of my achievements wasn't based on ignorance. It was based on a fundamental belief that certain kinds of success didn't count, that certain kinds of people couldn't earn real respect. The pattern was clear now. My father destroyed dreams that threatened his worldview, redirected ambitions that he couldn't control, and silenced voices that questioned his authority. He'd done it to Jessica, to Tony, to my mother, and to countless others who'd made the mistake of wanting something he didn't understand. Now he was coming for Marcus, and he was using me as the cautionary tale. That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at glow-in-the-dark stars Marcus had stuck to my ceiling when he was 8 years old. For the first time in my military career, I felt truly defeated. Not by enemy fire or impossible odds, but by the realization that I couldn't protect the person who mattered most to me. My father had made his strategy clear: surrender my career and validate his worldview, or watch him systematically destroy Marcus's dreams the same way he'd destroyed everyone else's. It was psychological warfare at its most personal, and he'd chosen his battlefield perfectly. But as I lay there listening to the house settle around me, something shifted in my thinking. I'd spent 8 years learning to solve impossible problems, to find tactical advantages in situations that seemed hopeless. My father thought he held all the cards, but he'd made one critical miscalculation. He'd underestimated what I'd learned about leadership, strategy, and the power of proving people wrong. I couldn't fight him directly. That would only confirm his narrative about my military service, making me aggressive and inappropriate. I couldn't argue with him using logic or facts. He'd already dismissed 8 years of documented achievements as meaningless. But maybe I could outmaneuver him using something he'd never seen coming. The very system he was trying to force me to abandon. The next morning, I found Marcus in the garage, half-heartedly organizing tools while our father got ready for work. His shoulders were slumped in a way I'd never seen before, like someone had physically beaten the enthusiasm out of him. "Hey," I said, closing the door behind me. "We need to talk." Marcus looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "If you're going to tell me Dad's right about college being more important than military service, save it. I got the message loud and clear last night. Actually, I wanted to tell you about something that happened during my last deployment," I said, settling onto an overturned crate. "We had this mission that seemed impossible. Taliban had taken over a village, civilians were trapped, and every conventional approach would have gotten people killed." Marcus's interest flickered despite himself. "What did you do?" "I realized that sometimes you can't win by fighting the battle your enemy wants you to fight. You have to change the game entirely." I leaned forward. "Marcus, what if I told you that there's a way for you to pursue military service that Dad literally cannot argue with?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if you could serve your country, get the best military training in the world, and graduate from Harvard Law School simultaneously?" Marcus stared at me. "That's impossible." "No, it's not. It's called the Judge Advocate General's Corps. JAG officers are military lawyers. They attend civilian law schools on full military scholarships, then serve as attorneys handling military legal matters. It's one of the most prestigious tracks in the entire military. I watched as understanding dawned in Marcus's eyes. You mean I could be both, lawyer and soldier? More than that. JAG officers often become federal judges, high-level government attorneys, even Supreme Court justices. It's exactly the kind of prestigious career path Dad claims to want for you, except you'd be serving your country while doing it. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing. But Dad said military service was a waste of potential. Dad said a lot of things about my career too. But what he doesn't know is that I've been selected for something that's going to make it very difficult for him to keep calling me a failure. I pulled out my phone and showed Marcus the email I'd been saving for the right moment. I've been offered a position as Multi-Domain Operations Coordinator at Joint Operations Command. It's one of the highest-level strategic positions a captain can hold. What does that mean? It means I coordinate military operations across all branches of service: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Space Force. It means generals ask for my input on national security strategies. It means the Pentagon considers me essential personnel for some of the most classified operations in the military. Marcus's jaw dropped. And Dad doesn't know? Dad doesn't know because I haven't decided whether to accept yet. The position comes with certain requirements that would make it impossible for me to take civilian jobs for the next several years. It would effectively end any possibility of me following his career advice. Why haven't you accepted? I looked at my brother, really looked at him. 17 years old, brilliant, idealistic, everything I'd been trying to protect. Because I was afraid of what it would cost me. But I'm starting to realize that some things are worth fighting for, even when the people you love can't understand why. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. The first real smile I'd seen from him since I'd come home. So what's the plan, Captain? The plan is to show Dad that military service isn't about becoming less than you could be. It's about becoming more than you ever imagined possible. Over the next 3 days, I taught Marcus everything I knew about strategic planning and tactical patience. Not military tactics, family tactics. How to present information in ways that couldn't be dismissed. How to build cases that were logically bulletproof. How to make people think new ideas were their own. The key, I explained as we sat in his room with his laptop open to JAG Corps requirements, is understanding your opponent's psychology. Dad doesn't respect military service, but he does respect prestige and exclusivity. So we don't lead with military. We lead with Harvard Law School acceptance rates. Marcus caught on quickly. Too quickly, actually. It was a little scary how naturally gifted he was at strategic thinking. Within an hour, he'd created a presentation that would make any parent proud. JAG Corps acceptance rates, lower than most Ivy League schools. Starting salaries, higher than most corporate law positions. Career advancement opportunities. Federal judgeships, Supreme Court clerkships, high-level government positions. This is brilliant, he said, scrolling through his research. But what about you? How are we going to change Dad's mind about your career? That's when I told him about the others. Not other family members, other military officers who'd faced similar battles with families who didn't understand the value of service. I'd been building a network without realizing it, connecting with women who dealt with parents who saw military careers as failures rather than achievements. There was Major Lisa Rodriguez, whose father still introduced her as my daughter who plays soldier, despite her PhD in strategic studies and her role advising NATO commanders. Captain Jennifer Walsh, whose mother regularly sent her job listings for normal careers, even though Jennifer had been selected for the Pentagon's most elite strategic planning unit. Colonel Sandra Kim, whose family had staged an intervention similar to mine, convinced she was wasting her potential in what they called, quote, government work. We started meeting informally, I told Marcus, sharing strategies for dealing with family pressure, comparing notes on how to explain military careers to people who were determined not to understand them. And we realized something important. Our family's dismissal of our achievements wasn't really about military service. It was about control. These women had helped me understand that the problem wasn't my father's ignorance about military careers. It was his need to be the authority on what constituted success. My achievements threatened his position as the family expert on professional advancement. My independence challenged his role as decision-maker, and my refusal to seek his approval undermined his identity as patriarch. But they'd also taught me something more valuable: how to use that need for control against itself. Colonel Kim had won over her skeptical family by arranging for them to attend a Pentagon briefing where she presented strategy recommendations to three-star generals. Major Rodriguez had invited her father to a ceremony where she received a commendation from the Secretary of Defense. Captain Walsh had simply started copying her mother on emails from superior officers praising her work. "You see," I explained to Marcus, "they all stopped trying to convince their families that military service was valuable. Instead, they made it impossible for their families to deny the evidence of their success." Marcus leaned forward, understanding dawning in his eyes. "So we don't argue with Dad about whether military service is worthwhile. We show him proof that he can't dismiss." "Exactly. And the Joint Operations Command position I've been offered? It comes with certain perks that would be very difficult for Dad to ignore." I showed Marcus the full details of the position I'd been keeping secret. Multi-Domain Operations Coordinator wasn't just a fancy title. It came with security clearances that required FBI background checks, access to classified briefings attended by cabinet-level officials, and direct reporting relationships with general officers whose names appeared regularly in national security news. "When you coordinate operations involving billions of dollars in resources and thousands of personnel," I said, "it becomes very hard for anyone to dismiss your work as playing soldier." Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what I was showing him. "But why haven't you accepted yet?" "Because accepting means I can't take civilian jobs for the next several years. It means committing to a career path that Dad will never understand or approve of. It means choosing military service over family approval, permanently." Marcus looked at me with something like admiration. "That's exactly why you should accept." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My mother, who'd been mostly silent during the family intervention, slipped into my room 3 nights later while my father was at his weekly poker game. She sat on the edge of my bed, holding a manila envelope that looked like it had been hidden for years. "I need to show you something," she said quietly, her hands shaking as she opened the envelope. "Something I should have shown you a long time ago." Inside were letters. Dozens of them, dating back 8 years. Letters from my commanding officers, commendations from superior officers, copies of citations I'd never seen. My mother had been secretly requesting copies of my military records, keeping a complete file of every achievement, every promotion, every recognition I'd earned. "Mom," I whispered, staring at a letter from a 2-star general praising my leadership during a crisis operation in Afghanistan. "Why didn't you ever tell me you had these?" "Because your father made me promise not to encourage what he called your military fantasy," she said, tears starting to fall. "But Sarah, I need you to understand something. When I gave up my PhD program to marry your father, I told myself it was because supporting his career was more important than pursuing my own. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of failing, scared of not being good enough, scared of disappointing people." She pulled out another document, my selection for the Bronze Star, with a detailed description of the actions that earned it. "When I read about what you did in Syria, about how you coordinated the evacuation of civilians under enemy fire, about how you saved 17 lives, I realized that you'd become everything I was too afraid to try to be." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your father isn't just wrong about military service being worthless. He's terrified of it. He's terrified of what you've accomplished, because it proves that there are kinds of success he could never achieve, kinds of respect he could never earn." She showed me more documents. Letters from soldiers I'd served with, describing how my leadership had kept them alive. After-action reports detailing operations I'd planned and executed. Performance evaluations that used words like exceptional, outstanding, and recommend for immediate advancement. "Your father spent 20 years climbing the corporate ladder to reach middle management," my mother continued. You've spent 8 years earning the respect of generals, the trust of soldiers, and the gratitude of people whose lives you've saved. Do you understand why that threatens him? The pieces started falling into place. This wasn't about Marcus's future or my career choices. This was about my father's deep, fundamental insecurity about his own achievements. In his world, success was measured by salary and status symbols, but military service operated on entirely different metrics: honor, sacrifice, competence under pressure, life and death responsibility. He's been telling people you're wasting your potential, my mother said, but I've seen your actual military records. I know what you really do, what you've really accomplished. Sarah, you outrank most of the men in our extended family, and you've earned it through merit, not politics or connections. I stared at a classified performance evaluation I'd never seen before. It recommended me for promotion ahead of schedule and described my work as essential to national security operations. At the bottom, a handwritten note from my commanding officer. Captain Chen represents the absolute best of military leadership. Recommend for highest-level strategic positions. There's more, my mother said, pulling out the last document in the envelope. It was a letter from the Joint Operations Command, marked confidential. Not the offer I'd received, something else entirely. How did you get this? I may have given up my academic career, but I never stopped knowing how to research. I contacted your commanding officer and requested a full assessment of your qualifications and career potential. She paused. Sarah, do you know what multi-domain operations coordinators actually do? I nodded, but she continued anyway. They plan military operations that involve billions of dollars in resources and coordinate activities across every branch of the armed forces. The position you've been offered has a security clearance level that requires approval from the Secretary of Defense. There are currently only 12 people in the entire military authorized for that specific role. My hands were shaking as I read the document. It wasn't just a job offer. It was a comprehensive evaluation of my career potential, written by officers whose names I recognized from national security briefings. Your father calls you a girl with a gun, my mother said, but the Pentagon considers you essential personnel for national defense operations. That night, staring at the classified documents my mother had somehow obtained, I realized that proving my worth to my father wasn't enough anymore. The evidence was overwhelming. I had achieved things he could never dismiss, earned respect he could never diminish, and been selected for positions he could never understand. But I also understood now that his contempt for my service wasn't based on ignorance. It was based on fear. Fear that his definition of success was incomplete. Fear that his 20-year climb up the corporate ladder was insignificant compared to 8 years of military leadership. Fear that his daughter had outgrown his ability to control or define her worth. I needed a plan that would expose not just my achievements but the fundamental dishonesty of his entire worldview about military service and women's capabilities. And I knew exactly when and how to do it. The family reunion was 3 weeks away. Every summer, my father's extended family gathered at my uncle's lake house for what was essentially a networking event disguised as a family barbecue. Cousins compared salaries, parents bragged about children's accomplishments, and my father positioned himself as the unofficial authority on career success and family values. This year, he'd already been telling relatives about my decision to leave the military and pursue a real career. He'd been using me as a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting daughters make their own choices, about what happened when young women prioritized independence over family wisdom. But what my father didn't know was that the reunion fell on the same weekend as the Pentagon's annual Strategic Planning Conference, an event where the most senior military leaders gathered to brief civilian officials on national security priorities. And thanks to my security clearance and role in multi-domain operations, I had been invited to attend. More than invited, I had been specifically requested to present a briefing on cross-service coordination strategies to an audience that would include the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I spent the next 2 weeks carefully orchestrating every detail. I reached out to Colonel Kim, Major Rodriguez, and Captain Walsh, explaining my situation and asking for their help. They not only agreed to support my plan, they enthusiastically volunteered to participate. Your father needs to understand that dismissing military service means dismissing some of the most accomplished women in America, Colonel Kim said during our planning call. And maybe it's time he learned that lesson publicly. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would attend the family reunion as expected, playing the role of the dutiful daughter considering her father's career advice. But I would also bring documentation of what I was actually doing that weekend, not just the Pentagon conference invitation, but the full scope of responsibilities that came with my security clearance and strategic position. Marcus helped me prepare the materials, his natural gift for presentation making our case bulletproof. We gathered testimonials from soldiers I'd served with, commendations from superior officers, and detailed descriptions of operations I'd planned and executed. But most importantly, we compiled a comprehensive comparison between my father's career achievements and my own. 20 years in corporate insurance had earned him a middle management position overseeing 12 employees and a modest suburban lifestyle. 8 years in military service had earned me strategic responsibilities affecting national security, leadership over hundreds of personnel, and the respect of some of the most senior officers in the American military. The beautiful thing, Marcus observed as we reviewed our presentation, is that we're not arguing with Dad's values. We're using his own metrics: responsibility, authority, prestige, impact, to prove he's been wrong about your career. The final piece of the plan was accepting the Joint Operations Command position. Not quietly, privately, the way I'd been considering. Publicly, with full military honors, in a ceremony that would be impossible for my family to ignore or dismiss. I called my commanding officer and accepted the position, requesting that the announcement ceremony be scheduled for the week after the family reunion. Then I contacted the local newspaper's military affairs reporter and arranged for coverage of the event. My father wanted to control the narrative about my career? Fine. But he was about to discover that some stories are too big, too important, and too well documented to be controlled by family politics and suburban expectations. The family reunion was exactly as I'd expected. 43 relatives gathered around my uncle's deck, drinking beer and comparing achievements like trading cards. My father held court near the grill, regaling cousins with stories about Marcus's Harvard Law School prospects, while carefully avoiding any mention of my actual military career. "Sarah's finally coming to her senses," I heard him tell my Uncle Robert. "Ready to put this soldier phase behind her and start a real career. I've got her lined up with some excellent opportunities in the private sector." I sat quietly for 2 hours, playing the role of the dutiful daughter considering her options. I nodded when relatives asked about my plans for the future. I smiled when they suggested I'd be happier in a normal job. I even thanked my father when he presented me with another folder of civilian job applications, this time with salary ranges highlighted in yellow. But when my cousin David started his annual presentation about his promotion to regional sales manager, I knew it was time. "That's really impressive, David," I said, standing up with my phone in hand. "Speaking of career updates, I have some news to share too." The deck went quiet. 43 pairs of eyes turned toward me, expecting another announcement about my transition to civilian life. "I've been offered a promotion," I said, pulling up the official email on my phone. "Multi-Domain Operations Coordinator, Joint Operations Command." It's a strategic position coordinating military operations across all 5 branches of the armed forces. My father's smile faltered slightly. "Sarah, this isn't really the time. Actually, Dad, I think it's exactly the time." I turned to address the entire gathering. "See, I've been listening to everyone talk about their careers, their achievements, their responsibilities, and I realized that maybe I should share what I actually do for a living." I pulled up the presentation Marcus and I had prepared. This position requires top-secret clearance approved by the Secretary of Defense. There are currently 12 people in the entire military authorized for this role. The operations I coordinate involve billions of dollars in resources and thousands of personnel across multiple theaters of operation. Uncle Robert looked confused. "But David, you said Sarah was leaving the military." "I said Sarah was wasting her potential in the military," my father corrected, his voice tight. "Playing soldier instead of building a real career." That's when I pulled up the comparison chart. "Let's talk about real careers, Dad. In your 20 years with Midwest Insurance, you've reached middle management overseeing 12 employees. Your annual salary is $68,000, and your biggest responsibility is reviewing quarterly reports." The deck was dead silent now. "In my 8 years of military service, I've risen to captain, earned a Bronze Star for valor, and been selected for a position that reports directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. My security clearance allows me access to information that affects national security policy. My decisions impact operations in 4 different countries. My father stood up, his face red. Sarah, that's enough. My annual salary is $94,000, not including benefits that would cost $60,000 in the private sector. I manage budgets larger than most corporations and lead teams of soldiers who trust me with their lives. I looked directly at him. So when you say I'm wasting my potential, what exactly do you mean? The silence stretched for 30 seconds. Then my phone rang. It was my commanding officer, calling exactly as we'd planned. "Excuse me," I said, answering on speaker. "Captain Chen." "Sarah, this is General Morrison. I need to brief you on the Pentagon conference situation. Are you available for a secure call in 10 minutes? We need your input on the multi-domain strategy presentation." "Yes, sir. I'll call you back on secure line in 10 minutes. "Outstanding. Also, congratulations on the promotion announcement. The Secretary of Defense specifically requested you for this position. We're honored to have you on the team." I hung up and looked around the deck. 43 faces stared back at me, processing what they'd just heard. "So," I said, putting my phone away, "anyone have questions about my career prospects?" The drive home from the family reunion was the quietest 2 hours of my life. My father sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window while my mother drove. Marcus rode in the back with me, occasionally catching my eye in the side mirror with a look that was part admiration, part concern. My father didn't speak to me for 3 days. Not because he was angry. I'd seen his anger before, and this was different. This was the silence of someone whose fundamental worldview had been shattered in front of 43 witnesses. For 20 years, he'd positioned himself as the family authority on career success. In 20 minutes, his daughter had dismantled that authority using his own metrics. When he finally approached me, it was on Thursday evening as I packed for my return to Fort Bragg. He stood in my doorway for a long moment before speaking. "I don't understand your career," he said quietly. "I never have. But I owe you an apology." I looked up from folding my uniform. "For what?" "For calling you worthless. For dismissing your achievements. For trying to force you into a life that would have made you smaller than you are." He paused. "And for trying to do the same thing to Marcus." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. For the first time in my adult life, my father asked questions about my military service without dismissing the answers. He wanted to know about the Bronze Star, about the soldiers I'd led, about what it meant to coordinate operations across multiple branches of service. "When that general called you," he said, "I realized that I've been measuring your success by standards that don't apply to what you do. You're not a middle manager or a corporate executive. You're something I don't have words for." 3 weeks later, I stood in the Pentagon briefing room where I'd been officially sworn in as multi-domain operations coordinator. My parents were there, along with Marcus, who'd already submitted his application for the JAG Corps program. The ceremony was covered by military news outlets and local media. But the moment that mattered most came afterward, when my father approached General Morrison. "Sir," he said, his voice careful and respectful, "I wanted to thank you for what you've done for my daughter." General Morrison smiled. "Mr. Chen, with all due respect, we haven't done anything for Captain Chen. She's done everything for us. Your daughter is one of the finest officers I've had the privilege to serve with. We're honored to have her leading our most critical operations." My father nodded, absorbing words he'd never expected to hear about his worthless daughter. 6 months later, I received a package at my new office in the Pentagon. Inside was a framed photograph from the family reunion, the moment right after General Morrison's phone call, when 43 relatives sat in stunned silence. Attached was a note from my father. "Sarah, I spent 20 years building a career I thought would make me proud. You spent 8 years building a career that made me proud and didn't even know it. Thank you for teaching me the difference between success and achievement. Love, Dad." Today I coordinate military operations that protect American interests in 4 different theaters. I brief cabinet-level officials on national security strategies. I lead teams of officers who've been entrusted with some of the most sensitive responsibilities in the military. But more importantly, I've learned that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on foreign soil. They're fought at family barbecues, where daughters have to prove that their dreams are valid, their achievements are real, and their worth isn't determined by other people's understanding. Marcus graduated from Harvard Law School last year and is now a JAG officer serving with distinction. My mother went back to school and finished her PhD at 53. And my father has become one of my strongest advocates, proudly telling anyone who'll listen about his daughter, the multi-domain commander. Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who understand us least. But with patience, evidence, and unwavering conviction in your own worth, you can teach them to see you clearly. The military taught me how to lead soldiers. My family taught me how to lead by example. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.